The Interspecies Historical Archive had a protocol for everything: documentation standards, observation ethics, the precise methodology for recording the behaviors of sentient species without allowing personal bias to contaminate the academic record. Historian Verath of the Solani had followed every protocol for 63 years. He had documented the Drevian funeral rites, the Kavari mating ceremonies, the Sarati tradition of burning their warships after a victory, because keeping them felt like keeping something that had already been used for its one true purpose. He had seen things that required new vocabulary. He had never required new vocabulary for humans. Until now. The survey outpost on Maren IV was small. 12 humans. A research team studying the local megafauna with the specific enthusiasm humans brought to things that could kill them, which, in Verath's 63 years of interspecies documentation, appeared to be most things. He had been embedded with them for 11 days. Documenting their research methodology, what he had documented so far was largely unremarkable. Humans worked long hours. They argued about data interpretation with an intensity that suggested the data had personally offended them. They consumed a hot liquid called coffee at volumes that the Solani medical database listed as physiologically inadvisable. Standard. Expected. Then the Verath predator appeared at the outpost perimeter at 0600 on day 12. The Verath were the apex predator of Maren IV. 600 kilograms of territorial aggression that the outpost had been carefully avoiding for 11 days. It appeared at the perimeter fence, bleeding heavily from 3 separate wounds, and Dr. Kael Orin, lead researcher, 11 years of field experience, the human Verath had been shadowing, looked at it for exactly 4 seconds. Then he picked up his medical kit. "Someone get the gate," he said. Verath opened his documentation log and wrote the first of what would become 417 notes. The gate opened inward. That was the first note, not because the direction of the gate mattered architecturally, but because opening a gate inward meant moving toward the thing outside it rather than creating distance. Every species Verath had ever documented, everyone across 63 years of interspecies historical work, designed their perimeter exits to open outward, away from the threat. Humans had built this one to open toward it. He didn't know if that was intentional. He suspected it wasn't. He suspected it was simply the direction that made sense to them. That was somehow worse. Dr. Orin walked through the gate at a measured pace. Not fast, not slow. The specific pace of someone who had calculated that running would trigger a predatory response and had decided not to trigger it, and had made that calculation in approximately 4 seconds while picking up a medical kit. The Verath was 6 meters from a gate. 600 kilograms. 3 wounds. Blood loss visible in the trail leading from the treeline to the perimeter. The creature's weight was distributed unevenly. Right forelimb compensating for damage, to the left, the specific body language of something in pain, trying not to show pain, because showing pain in its ecosystem meant something else would finish what had started it. Orin stopped 4 meters away, crouched down, made himself smaller. Verath noted this carefully, the deliberate reduction of physical profile. Solani research on interspecies communication documented this as a submission posture. The human wasn't submitting. He was just making himself less large. The distinction was subtle, and Verath wasn't entirely certain he understood it yet. "Hey," Orin said. One word. Quiet. Conversational. Like greeting a colleague in a corridor. The Verath's head swung toward him. Eyes tracking. Threat assessment running at full capacity behind those pupils. Orin didn't move. "I can see 3, he said, still in that same quiet tone. "There might be more. I need to get closer to check." He was talking to it, explaining himself, to a predator that did not speak his language, to a creature that had no framework for explanation. Verath wrote 6 words in his documentation log and then stopped because 6 words weren't enough and he didn't have more yet. Permission was not granted. Not exactly. What happened was this. The Verath held its position for 40 seconds, Verath counted, and then lowered its massive head by approximately 15 degrees and held it there. Orin took that as a yes. Verath noted that a 63-year veteran xenobiologist with 4 published volumes on predator behavior would not have taken that as a yes, would have required considerably more data before drawing that conclusion, would have convened a review committee, Orin moved forward. 1 meter. Stopped. Waited. The Verath didn't move. Another meter. The wounds were clearer now. 2 on the left flank, parallel, deep, the kind of damage that suggested another predator rather than environmental injury. 1 on the right shoulder, older at the edges, a fight that had started before today. Yeah, Orin said quietly. You've been at this a while. He opened the medical kit. Slowly. Every movement deliberate. His hands visible at all times in a way that Verath recognized from his documentation of 17 other species as the universal biological signal of non-threat. Empty hands. Open movements. No sudden anything. The Verath watched every centimeter. Orin made a sound. Not words. Something lower. Rhythmic. Almost tuneless, but structured. The specific quality of a sound designed not to communicate meaning, but to communicate presence. I am here. I am not leaving. I am not hiding what I am doing. Verath had heard humans make the sound before. To injured members of their own species. To young ones who were frightened. To the hot liquid called coffee, occasionally when it was particularly good. He had not heard it directed at a 600-kilogram apex predator from 4 meters away. He wrote in his log, "The human is making a comfort sound. Classification, caregiving register, context, incompatible with situation as previously understood." Then he wrote one more line, revising previous understanding. 3 other researchers had gathered at the gate behind Verath. He had not noticed them arrive. Dr. Senna, botanist, 2nd year on Maren IV, the youngest on the team, was standing beside him. She had her personal recorder raised, but wasn't speaking into it. Just watching. Does he do this often? Verath asked. He hadn't meant to ask out loud. Define often, Senna said. Has he done this before? On Karath Station, he spent 4 hours coaxing a wounded Dreth hound out from under the equipment bay, she said. On the Maren II survey, he set the leg of something that the field guide said was functionally untreatable. And before that, Senna thought about it. I've only worked with him for 2 years, she said. But Dr. Orin has a reputation. What kind of reputation? Verath asked. She watched Orin move to within 2 meters of the Verath, medical kit open, still making that low, rhythmic sound. The kind, she said, where injured things find him. Verath looked at her, then back at Orin. Find him, he repeated slowly. We've had 4 in the 2 years I've been on his team, she said. Different planets, different species. She paused. Different everything. And he treats them all. Every time. Verath looked down at his documentation log, at the 6 words he'd written that weren't enough. Added 7 more. They come to him. He does not go to them. Contact at 1 meter. Verath documented the exact time, the exact distance, the exact atmospheric conditions because 63 years of discipline did not stop simply because his hands were doing something he could only describe as shaking slightly. Orin's left hand made contact with the Verath's flank. Not grabbing, not restraining, resting, the specific weight of a hand that was saying, I am here rather than I have you. The Verath's entire musculature tensed simultaneously. 600 kilograms of predatory biology responding to contact with something that was, by every ecological metric, prey. The tension moved through the creature like a current. Visible. Total. Orin didn't remove his hand. Didn't freeze. He kept making the sound, and waited for the tension to find its ceiling. It took 11 seconds. Verath counted everyone. Then the Verath exhaled a long, pressurized release that Verath's recorder caught at 340 decibels, and the tension dropped. Not gone, but manageable. Orin began working. The first wound took 8 minutes. Irrigation, debridement, closure with a biological adhesive that Orin applied with instruments designed for human tissue and adapted in real time for something with completely different biology. Verath watched him make 4 adjustments to his technique in the first 3 minutes alone. Each one assessed, implemented, evaluated, revised. No hesitation between adjustments. The revision was the work. "You're adapting," Verath said. He hadn't meant to speak again. "Always," Orin said without looking up. "Field medicine is mostly adaptation. Your instruments are not designed for this biology. No, you have no data on Verath physiology." "Not much," Orin agreed. "Some surface morphology from the survey scans. General megafauna trauma response patterns." He moved to the second wound. "The rest is reading." "Reading," Verath repeated, "watching how it responds. What causes tension? What eases it? You adjust." A pause. "Medicine is a conversation. You just have to learn the language on the way." Verath wrote that down verbatim, then wrote beneath it, "This appears to be a common human framework, applied here to a species it was not designed for." Without apparent awareness that this is extraordinary, the second wound was deeper. Orin saw it and was quiet for a moment. The Verath felt the shift in his attention somehow. Its head turned, those eyes finding his face. "I know," Orin said. "This one's going to take longer." He reached into the kit for the secondary instrument set. "Senna," he called back toward the gate. "Yeah. Can you bring the portable light unit and the secondary adhesive pack?" Footsteps. Senna moving back toward the outpost. The Verath tractor movement. Head swinging. Assessment running. "Hey." Orin's voice. Quiet. Redirecting. "She's getting something to help. She'll be back." The head swung back to him. Stayed. Verath stopped writing for a moment. Not because nothing was happening. Because too much was happening and he needed a second to decide where to put it. The creature had redirected its attention based on a human voice. Not a command. Not a frequency signal or a chemical prompt or any of the 17 documented methods of predator attention redirection in the interspecies behavioral database. A voice, explaining what was happening. And the Verath had listened. Historian Verath. He looked up. Orin was watching him over his shoulder. "You might want to move closer," the human said. "The next part is interesting." Verath moved closer. He would reflect on this later. The fact that he did it without hesitation. 63 years of observation protocol. Strict documentation distance. The foundational principle of historical fieldwork. The observer does not enter the scene. He crossed the distance in 8 steps. Stood 2 meters from a 600-kilogram apex predator. And opened his documentation log. Because if the human thought this was interesting, he had learned in 11 days to trust that assessment entirely. The second wound required improvisation, not adaptation. Verath was beginning to understand the difference. Adaptation was adjusting existing tools to new contexts. Improvisation was creating new tools from nothing because existing ones were insufficient. Orin did both simultaneously. The depth of the wound exceeded the reach of his standard closure instruments. He looked at his kit for approximately 4 seconds. Then he looked at the wound. Then at his kit again. Then he took 2 instruments that were not designed to work together, held them in a configuration that the manufacturer had certainly not intended, and created a reach extension that functioned precisely as needed. "Did you just," Verath started. "Field medicine," Orin said. "You modified the instrument, combined 2 instruments, without prior planning. You don't always get prior planning." Verath wrote, "Improvisation under constraint treated as routine, not a problem to be solved, a condition to be worked within." The Verath held completely still through all of it. Senna had returned with the light unit and positioned it without being asked the specific efficiency of people who have worked together long enough that instructions are redundant. She held it at the angle Orin needed, adjusting twice as his working position shifted, saying nothing. Verath noted the team dynamic, the wordless coordination, the shared understanding of what the work required without the work being discussed. He had documented this in human research teams before, had never seen it extended to include the patient. Because the Verath was part of the coordination now, holding still when Orin needed stillness, shifting weight by centimeters when the working angle required it, responding to a slight pressure from Orin's hand the way a patient who understood the procedure would respond. "It's cooperating," Verath said. "Yes," Orin said. "Actively." "Yes." "It's never been treated before. It has no framework for medical procedure. It has no reason to understand what you're doing." "Sure it does," Orin said. "What reason?" The first wound stopped hurting. He moved to the third. It made the connection. Verath stood very still for a moment. Processing. The Verath had made a causal connection between Orin's intervention and the cessation of pain, and had extended trust based on that connection to subsequent intervention from a member of a species it had never encountered, in a situation with no ecological precedent. In under 40 minutes. "Your species does this," Verath said slowly. Not a question, working through it out loud. "You encounter wounded predators and you help them," Orin said simply. "Why?" Orin was quiet for a moment, working on the third wound. The sound still going, that low, rhythmic present sound that had not stopped once in 40 minutes. "Same reason you help anything," he said finally, "which is—" "It's hurting," Orin said, "and you can do something about it." Verath looked at him. At the Verath. At Senna holding the light unit at the precise angle needed. At the trail of blood leading from the trilene that the creature had followed to arrive at a perimeter fence it had somehow understood was a boundary worth stopping at rather than breaching. At the gate that opened inward. He wrote in his documentation log for a long time. When he stopped, he had covered 6 pages. The last line read, "The question is not why humans help wounded predators. The question is why every other species in the documented galaxy requires a reason not to." He looked up from the log. Orin had finished the third wound, was now sitting back on his heels, kit closed, watching the Verath with the expression Verath had come to recognize in 11 days as the human resting state after completing something difficult. Not pride, not relief, something quieter, satisfaction perhaps, but the kind that didn't need an audience. The Verath was breathing steadily. All 3 wounds closed. The compensating weight distribution on the right forelimb was already beginning to correct, the creature shifting its weight experimentally, testing what hurt and what didn't, finding that less hurt than before. Its head turned to Orin. Those predator eyes. Full assessment capacity. The gaze that had ended things across Maren IV's entire ecological history. On him. For a long moment. Then it made a sound. Low. Single. Not aggressive. Not anything in any database Verath had ever accessed. What was that? Verath asked. Orin looked at the Verath. Then at Verath. "I don't know," he said, honestly. "But it's the same sound the Dreth hound made on Kara Station. And the creature on Maren IV?" Orin nodded slowly. "And the one before that," he said quietly. Verath stared at him. "They all made the same sound," he said. "Yes," Orin said. "Across different species. Different planets. Different biology. Entirely." "Yes. That's—" "I know," Orin said. The Verath made the sound again. Verath contacted the archive that evening. Not a routine update. An emergency academic consultation. The kind that required senior historian authorization and had been used exactly 11 times in the archive's 400-year history. He had been the requesting historian twice before, once for the Sarati burning ceremony, once for a Kavari behavioral anomaly that had required 3 new classification categories and a revised volume of the interspecies behavioral compendium. This was the 3rd time. Senior historian Davin answered the consultation link from his archive office on Solani Prime. He was old, older than Verath, one of 4 historians in the archive's current roster who had been documenting before first contact with humans, who remembered what the interspecies behavioral database looked like before a species arrived that kept requiring new entries. He looked at Verath's expression on the link. Then he picked up his own documentation log. "Tell me," he said. Verath told him. The gate that opened inward, the 4 seconds of assessment, the medical kit, the crouching down to reduce profile, the comfort sound applied to an apex predator, the improvised instrument modification. The Verath cooperating with procedure. The causal connection made in under 40 minutes. The sound, the same sound, across 4 species, 4 planets, 4 entirely separate biological architectures. When he finished, Davin was quiet for a long time. You recorded all of it, he said finally. 432 notes, Verath said. 17 acoustic recordings. Continuous visual documentation from 0600 to 1340. And the human's explanation, Davin said, when you asked why. It's hurting, Verath said, and you can do something about it. Another silence. That's the complete explanation? He seemed to feel it was sufficient, Verath said. Davin set down his documentation log, which Verath had never seen him do during a consultation. Verath, he said, how long have you been embedded with this team? 11 days before today. And in 11 days, before this morning, what did you document? Standard research methodology, data collection, team dynamics, consumption of inadvisable quantities of coffee. Nothing that required emergency consultation. No, but this did. Yes. Why? Davin asked. Specifically, in your own assessment. Verath considered the question carefully. He had been considering it since 0800 that morning, since the gate opened inward, since he had written 6 words that weren't enough and then 432 more that still felt insufficient. Because he said slowly, every behavior I documented today exists in the archive. Separately. Explain. Approach behavior toward injured organisms documented. Predator communication attempts documented. Medical improvisation documented. Cross-species trust establishment documented. He paused. Every individual component exists somewhere in our records, applied by some species to some situation across 400 years of historical documentation. But, Davin said, but no species has ever applied all of them simultaneously to an apex predator, without institutional framework. Without preparation, without apparent awareness that what they were doing was extraordinary. The human didn't think it was extraordinary, Davin said. He thought it was obvious, Verath said. That was the most extraordinary part. Davin was quiet for a very long time. Outside Verath's outpost quarters, the Maren IV night was settling in. Sounds of the research team's evening routine filtering through the walls. Someone laughing at something. The specific percussion of cooking equipment, the smell of coffee that Verath had come to associate with humans, the way he associated bioluminescence with the Kavari or harmonic speech with the Drevians. The sound, Davin said, finally, the same vocalization across 4 species. Yes, you have recordings of all 4. I contacted Dr. Orin's previous team leads this afternoon, Verath said. 3 of them had ambient recordings from the relevant incidents. The acoustic match is, he paused. I don't have a word for the acoustic match, Davin. Try. Identical isn't accurate because the biological architecture producing the sound is different each time. The frequencies differ by species. The duration differs. He looked at his analysis display, but the structure is the same. The pattern. The intent, if that word can be applied to nonverbal vocalization across unconnected species. What does the pattern mean? Davin asked. I don't know, Verath said, but I have a hypothesis. Tell me. It isn't a learned response, Verath said carefully. It isn't cultural. It isn't species-specific. It isn't environmental. He looked at his documentation log, at 432 notes that kept pointing at the same place. I think it's recognition. Recognition of what? Of something in the human, Verath said, something that the species making the sound identifies and responds to, consistently, across every biological and ecological difference. What something? Verath was quiet, because the word he had was not a word he had expected to write in a historical documentation log, not a clinical word, not a taxonomic category. Not the kind of language that survived peer review without significant pushback from the committee. But it was the accurate word, the only one that fit all 432 notes. Safety, he said. I think they recognize safety. Davin picked up his documentation log again, wrote something, set it down. I'm coming to Maren IV, he said. The archive doesn't authorize field visits for... I'm authorizing it, Davin said. Myself. For myself. He looked at Verath through the link. 81 years old. 400 years of archive history in his institutional memory. The historian who had written the definitive text on human behavioral documentation after first contact and had revised it 6 times since because humans kept requiring revision. Verath, he said, in 40 years of documenting this species, do you know what the archive's single most debated entry is? The empathy classification, Verath said immediately. Every historian knew it. The entry that had been written, challenged, revised, withdrawn, rewritten, and debated in every academic session for 40 years. The entry that tried to classify what humans did when they encountered suffering in any form from any source, and kept failing to find a category that held. Because every category implied limitation, and the human behavior implied none. Yes, Davin said, the empathy classification. He looked at his documentation log. I think you may have just given us the evidence that closes the debate. What conclusion does it support? Verath asked that we've been trying to classify it. Davin said, quietly, when we should have been trying to understand it. That night, Verath sat outside the outpost. Maren IV's sky was extraordinary, 3 moons in partial phase, the kind of atmospheric light that made everything look like it was being seen through something valuable. Orin was sitting nearby. He often sat outside in the evenings. Verath had documented it as a human behavioral pattern, the specific seeking of open sky after enclosed work. Something about distance. Something about perspective. They sat in companionable silence for a while. Then Orin said, How many notes today? 432, Verath said. Orin looked at him. For one morning. Yes. Orin was quiet for a moment. Was it the Verath? It was everything, Verath said. The Verath. The gate. The sound you make. The same sound 4 species have made in response to you across 4 different planets. Orin looked at the sky. You noticed that, he said. Yes. I didn't know someone was documenting it. Does it change anything? Verath asked, knowing. Orin thought about it. The 3 moons moved through their partial phases above them. No, he said finally. I'd have done the same thing either way. I know, Verath said. Then why ask? Because, Verath said, 432 notes, and that is still the most important one. Davin arrived on Maren IV 6 days later, 81 years old, the longest-serving historian in the archive's current roster, a being who had watched 400 years of interspecies history accumulate into the most comprehensive behavioral database in the known galaxy and had spent 40 of those years trying to write a single accurate entry about humans. He stepped off the transport, looked at the outpost, looked at Verath waiting at the perimeter, looked at the gate. It opens inward, he said. Yes, Verath said. Davin stood there for a moment, just looking at the gate. Show me everything, he said. Verath showed him everything. The full documentation from day 1. Every note, every acoustic recording, the visual log from the morning of the Verath, the 432 entries that had become 611 by the time Davin arrived because the 6 days between the consultation and his arrival had continued to produce material. Humans, Verath had discovered, did not have extraordinary days followed by ordinary ones. They simply had days, and the days kept being extraordinary. Davin sat with the documentation for 2 full days. He did not observe the team directly during this period. He read, reviewed, cross-referenced against 40 years of archive entries on human behavior, built the academic framework the way he had built every framework in his career, methodically without rushing to conclusions, letting the evidence find its own shape. On the 3rd day, he came to find Verath. Walk with me, he said. They walked the outpost perimeter. Maren IV's morning was clear. 3 moons faded to pale suggestions in the daylight sky, the sounds of the research team's work audible from the Eastern Survey area. The sound, Davin said, the cross-species vocalization. Yes, I've run it against the full archive database. every recorded vocalization across every documented species. And no match, Davin said, anywhere, in 400 years of documentation. Verath had expected this, had not expected how it would feel to have it confirmed. It's new, he said. Not new. Davin said carefully, undocumented, which is different. You think it existed before we recorded it? I think, Davin said, that it has always existed, in every species, dormant and used. He paused, because no species ever gave them a reason to produce it. Verath stopped walking. Until humans, he said. Until humans, Davin confirmed. They found Orin in the Eastern Survey area. He was alone, cataloging specimen samples, the specific focused quiet of someone doing work that required all of their attention and had all of it. He looked up when they approached, took in Davin, the age, the archive insignia, the documentation log, already open. You brought a colleague, he said to Verath. Senior historian Davin, Verath said, he has been reviewing my documentation. All 600 notes? 611, Verath said. Orin looked at Davin. Davin looked at Orin. The specific moment of two people assessing each other across a very large gap in context and finding, despite the gap, something recognizable on the other side. Dr. Orin, Davin said, I have one question. All right, Orin said. The Verath, Davin said, when you saw it at the perimeter, wounded, in the 4 seconds before you picked up the medical kit. He paused. What did you think? Orin was quiet, not the quiet of someone formulating an answer. The quiet of someone who hadn't been asked this before and was finding the honest version of it. I thought it was in pain, he said, and that I had a kit. That was all. That was everything, Orin said. That's usually how it works. Davin wrote in his log, for a long time. When he stopped, he looked at Verath. 611 notes, he said, and he just rendered them all into 2 sentences. That afternoon, Davin asked to observe directly. Not a specific event, just the team, working, being. They sat at the edge of the survey area for 3 hours, watching humans do what humans did, argue about data with personal intensity, coordinate without words, consume coffee at volumes the medical database still listed as inadvisable, make the comfort sound to each other when something was difficult, make a different sound, shorter, brighter, when something worked. At the 2-hour mark, the Verath appeared at the eastern tree line. Verath saw Davin go very still. The creature moved along the tree line, not approaching, not retreating, the specific movement of something in a territory it had always owned, moving differently than it had before the morning 6 days ago. Weight distribution corrected. All wounds closed. The compensation pattern in the right forelimb entirely gone. It paused at the point closest to Orin's position. Orin looked up from his samples. They regarded each other across 40 meters of Maren IV terrain. Then Orin raised one hand, a small gesture, casual, the human motion of acknowledgement between beings who have shared something and don't need to perform a fact of it. The Verath made the sound, single, low, carrying across the 40 meters without effort. Then it moved back into the tree line. Gone. Davin had not moved for 4 minutes. Verath waited. How often, Davin said finally. His voice had a quality Verath had never heard in it before. 81 years old. 400 years of archive history. How often does it come back? Every day since, Verath said. Same time, same position, same sound. It's checking on him, Davin said. Yes. The apex predator of Maren IV, Davin said slowly, is checking on the human who treated its wounds. Yes. And he acknowledges it. Every time. As if it's normal, Verath said. He treats it as entirely normal. Davin began writing that evening and did not stop until the Maren IV dawn came up through the outpost windows. Not notes, not documentation, entries. The revised archive classification. The one that had been written, challenged, withdrawn, rewritten, and debated for 40 years. The empathy entry. He wrote it differently this time, not as a classification of behavior, not as a taxonomic category with parameters and limitations and the careful hedging language that academic documentation required when the thing being documented kept exceeding every boundary placed around it. He wrote it as a record of a gate that opened inward, of 4 seconds and a medical kit, of a comfort sound that crossed every biological boundary the galaxy had erected, of a wounded predator that followed a blood trail to a perimeter fence and stopped there, because somehow across 600 kilograms of apex biology and zero shared language and no ecological precedent, it had understood that stopping was the right thing to do, that on the other side of that fence was something worth stopping for. He showed it to Verath at dawn. Verath read it once, then read it again. The committee will challenge it, he said. Yes, Davin said. The language is not standard academic documentation. No, you've written it almost like a story, Davin said. I know. He looked out the window at the Maren IV morning. Because that's what it is. And I've spent 40 years trying to put it in a category when what it needed was a witness. The committee, Davin said, can read the 611 notes and the acoustic recordings and the visual documentation, and then explain to me a better word than the one I used. What word did you use? Verath asked. Davin turned from the window, looked at Verath with 81 years of careful academic discipline and the specific expression of someone who has finally, after a very long time, found the accurate thing to say. Instinct, he said. I called it instinct. Empathy as instinct, Verath said slowly. Not a choice, Davin said. Not a cultural value. Not a learned behavior or a philosophical position. He looked at his documentation log, something prior to all of that, something that operates before the question of whether to help has been asked. Because for them, Verath said, the question is never whether. The question, Davin said, is only how. Orin was outside when they emerged. Morning coffee. The Maren IV dawn doing something extraordinary with the light through the 3 moons still visible at the horizon. He looked at them both, at Davin's documentation log and the expression of a historian who had just closed a 40-year debate, at Verath's face and the 611 notes that had brought it to this. Did you figure it out? He asked. We made progress, Davin said carefully. Orin nodded, drank his coffee. At the eastern treeline, right on schedule, the Verath appeared, moved to its position, made it sound. Orin raised his hand. The Verath moved back into the trees. Orin looked at his coffee. Same time every day, he said. Not to them. To himself. The quiet satisfaction of something predictable in an unpredictable job. Davin watched the treeline where the Verath had been. Then he wrote one final line in the revised classification entry. The last line. The one that would survive every committee challenge and every peer review and 40 more years of debate, because it was the only sentence in the entire document that was simply completely, inarguably true. They do not decide to help. They decide occasionally not to, and even then it costs them something. He closed the log. The Maren IV morning opened around them. Somewhere in the Eastern Survey area, Dr. Kael Orin finished his coffee, picked up a sample kit, and went back to work. The gate behind him stood open, inward, as it had always been, as it would always be,